Hello everyone. Today we will consider the revelation of historians on the topic of the harem. Be sure to read this article to the end. In it you will find answers to such questions as, did the harem exist only in the Ottoman Empire? What was its structure? Were the concubines just slaves sold to the palace? What happened to the sultans who wanted to marry someone outside the harem? The interest of Turkish society, and not only in history, has increased rapidly in recent years. This can be clearly seen if we look at the growing number of historical novels, history books, or historical programs broadcast on television around the world. The television series is at the center of the discussion. The Magnificent Century, which tells about the life of Suleiman the Magnificent and Hurrem Sultan, caused controversy about what the screenwriters showed there and what they did not. When the Sultan's personal life was shown in the series, which had not been done before, objections arose one after another. When it came to the Sultan's personal life, the harem was the most mysterious and curious place in Ottoman history, and what happened there became the main topic of discussion. We will look at an interview with historian Taner Akşam. When it comes to the harem, naturally, the first thing that comes to mind is the Ottoman harem. Is the harem an institution invented by the Ottomans? Or were there similar structures in other civilizations that were predecessors or contemporaries? Taner Akşam. There was a huge harem in China, including eunuchs. The Persians and Byzantium also had a harem. There were also eunuchs. In fact, the Ottoman Empire took the Sasanian and Byzantine state organizations as an example. The Ottomans were originally a community. They lived in tents. There was no harem. Having expanded into the Byzantine territory and inherited it, they gradually began to integrate some Byzantine institutions into themselves. It can be said that the Byzantine influence was too great. What were the similarities between the Byzantine and other imperial harems and the Ottoman harem? Taner Akşam. They were similar, especially in terms of intrigue. Maybe there was no poisoning in the Ottoman Empire, as in Byzantium, but the Ottoman harem is similar in terms of intrigues for the throne. I also consider Byzantium to be Eastern. In this sense, the Ottoman harem is similar to the harems of Eastern civilizations such as the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire. And what about the West? Taner Akşam. There were also women in the West who plotted intrigues, but they lived openly, and not like women in the Ottoman Empire outside the walls of the harem. In this sense, there is a difference between the Ottoman Empire and the West. When was the harem founded? Taner Akşam. The harem as a phenomenon developed and finally took shape during the reign of the Abbasid caliphs and became a model for subsequent harems of Islamic rulers. Under the first Abbasid caliphs, the women of the ruling family had their own household, and even palaces similar to those in which their male relatives lived. By the beginning of the 10th century, women became more isolated in the huge royal palace complex, and the harem became a separate isolated structure. For example, Masudi, writing in the middle of the 10th century, claims that Yahya Barmaked, who supervised the hurrem of Harun ar-Rashid, locked its gates at night and took the keys home with him. Gradually, the caliph's harem acquired its own fantastic image of a separate world, a closed environment of luxury and sexual arousal with a taste of cruelty and danger. There are several indications of the number of women who lived with their servants in the harem. Harun al-Rashid had more than 2,000 singers and maids in his hurrem. There were also 24 concubines who bore children by him. In the Ottoman Empire, the institution of the harem in its true sense was created during the time of Kanuni. Kanuni had 5 favorites and several concubines. So there was no harem before the Eve? Taner Akşam. Yavuz Sultan Selim, Kanuni Suleiman's father, spent his life on the battlefields. There was no question of creating a harem for him. His father Bayezid was also passionate about conquests. There were no large harems in their time. In real terms, we can say that the harem was created during the Eve period. The previous sultans have already married. If we ask why the great harems began on the Eve, it is obvious that the sultans withdrew from state affairs. The exception is IV. Murat did not even approach the women. Taner Akşam. Hurrem Sultan was the first to get married after she became a concubine. But the sultans before Suleiman also took the daughters of other Anatolian lords or neighboring kings as wives. For example, the father of Suleiman the Magnificent, Yavuz Sultan Selim, was the son-in-law of the Crimean Khan. Do these marriages end after the eve? Are wives chosen only among concubines? Tainer Aksham. With some exceptions, you can say yes to this question. The exception was the young Osman, who wanted to marry his teacher's daughter. This request provoked a strong reaction. This was one of the reasons for the uprising that led to his assassination. Sultan Abdulaziz also wanted to marry the daughter of an Egyptian Khedive, but this was prevented by the words, "We do not have such a custom." Until that time, it had long been forgotten that the sultans married women not from the harem. As a result, after the Kanuni period, there were no marriages outside the harem, and attempts to do so were not welcomed and suppressed. Besides, the harem was outside the palace before the Kanuni period, wasn't it? Tainer Aksham. And yes, the harem was located outside the palace until the time of Kanuni. Let me also point out that there was no question of Kanuni's participation in the life of the harem. The harem scenes shown in the series are fiction. The sultan could not be intimate with concubines of his own free will. He waited, and concubines were brought to him. The concubine was chosen by the Valide Sultan. What were the criteria for concubines here? Tainer Aksham. The mothers of the sultans have always been with their sons. They were sent to the Sanjaks with them, so they knew their sons very well. Mothers chose slaves for the harem and trained them. Were all the concubines taken into the harem as slaves, or were there some women among them who already knew in advance about their fate in the harem? Tainer Aksham. No. All the concubines were girls kidnapped by pirates. The most beautiful of them were left to be sent to the palace from the very beginning. After they arrive at the palace, they will undergo another selection and those who remain will be trained. But let me tell you that we cannot talk about those girls whose village was robbed and they were raped and then handed over to the slave market. Of course, there was no such thing. The exception was during the reign of Sultan Ibrahim. At that time, a pregnant girl was brought to the palace. After she gave birth to a child, she married a eunuch and sent him to Egypt. However, during the voyage, he and the child were captured by Venetian pirates and declared that the child was the sultan's son. That eunuch was Zumbul Aga. After these events, a Cretan expedition was organized. These are very interesting events, but so far it has received little coverage. Could the sultans have spent only one night with their concubines? Tainer Aksham. They were just unpopular people they spent the night with. If the sultan does not like this woman, he will spend only one night with this concubine. They spent more time with those they liked. By the way, you should not think about staying together only as a sexual one. For example, when Hurrem Sultan won Suleiman's heart, it could not be known only by sexual attraction. She also offered young concubines to her husband when she got older, but she also managed to keep her husband. Also, because Kanuni's reign lasted so long, her mother-in-law died during her husband's lifetime, so Hurrem Sultan also took on the role of Walid Sultan. We also point out that only concubines did not enter the harem. Physically, the harem was a very small area, but it was a huge organization. Everything in the harem was spelled out to the smallest detail, and this was strictly monitored. The harem also had a section for servants. The sultans did not appear in the harem. How many people were in the harem? Tainer Aksham. There were about 15,000 people in Topkapi Palace during its heyday. The population of the harem during Murad's reign was up to 300, but in previous periods the harem was much more modest. We can say that the population of the harem reached its peak during the reign of Murad. This shows the number of children the sultan had. By the way, I want to point out, recently, a mistake was made, and harem and enderun were confused with each other. These are two separate structures. They say, a harem is a university. This may be true for enderun, but the harem is a different structure. Only the sultan could enter there as a man. Finally, I would like to ask about the image of the harem. Since the 18th century, Western travelers and artists have talked about the harem or used it in their works. As far as I know, not a single foreigner has entered the harem. So how was this image of the harem created and reflected? Tainer Aksham. Perhaps we can answer this question in the context of Hurrem Sultan. Hurrem Sultan led a life outside the harem. He received ambassadors, intervened in state affairs, and ruled the state together with Suleiman the Magnificent. Thus, the life of a person like her, and therefore the harem, became a matter of curiosity. There are many documents about Hurrem Sultan from the Venetian and Austrian ambassadors. After Hurrem Sultan, curiosity about the lives of such influential women continued, and, naturally, foreigners began to talk about the harem. The unrealistic or exaggerated images taken here are not necessarily made with malicious intent as described. After all, it's a top-secret place, and people start making it up. Aren't fictions being made about the lives of celebrities today? In some ways, these fictionalized works were similar to the tabloid press of the time.